We are from God in the Stillness. That's been brought to us in a number of ways today. Readings, the music. So as you hear this story from 1 Kings 19, as Talash already said, this is a story within a much larger story. We're called to stillness, and yet there's so much that pulls at us. Listen as I read from chapter 19. Ahab told Jezebel all that Elijah had done, how he had killed all Baal's prophets with the sword. Now Jezebel sent a messenger saying, "May the gods do whatever they want to me if by this time tomorrow I haven't made your life like the life of one of them." Big, bold Elijah was terrified. He got up and ran for his life. He arrived at Beersheba in Judah and left his assistant there. He himself went further on into the desert, a day's journey. He finally sat under a solitary broom bush. He longed for his own death. "It's more than enough, Lord. Take my life, because I'm no better than my ancestors." So he lay down and slept under the broom bush. Then suddenly, a messenger tapped him and said, "Get up, eat something." Elijah opened his eyes and saw flatbread baked on glowing coals, as well as a jar of water. They were right by his head. He ate and drank and then went back to sleep. The Lord's messenger returned a second time and tapped him. "Get up, eat something, because you have a long, difficult road ahead of you." So Elijah got up, ate and drank, and went refreshed by that food for 40 days and nights until he arrived at Oreb, God's mountain. And there he went into a cave and spent the night. The Lord's word came to him and said, "Why are you here, Elijah?" Elijah replied, "I've been very passionate for the Lord God of heavenly forces, because the Israelites have abandoned your covenant. They have torn down your altars, and they have murdered your prophets with the sword. I'm the only one left, and now they want to take my life as well." The Lord spoke, "Go out and stand at the mountain before the Lord. The Lord's passing by." A very strong wind tore through the mountains and broke apart the stones before the Lord, but the Lord wasn't in the wind. After the wind, there was an earthquake, but the Lord wasn't in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, there was a fire, but the Lord wasn't in the fire either. After the fire, there was a sound, thin, quiet. When Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in his coat, and then he went out and stood at the cave's entrance. A voice came to him and said, "Why are you here, Elijah?" The word of the Lord. Listen. Listen. Quiet. Silence. Not always easy to welcome. Elijah, as you heard, is done. At least to our way of thinking, the story doesn't give nearly enough information to really know the state that Elijah's in. We can guess, we hear a few things. And yet it's fair to guess that exhaustion and now fear and terror have caught up with him. This brave man finally has met his match. He's done. He's lost his moorings. Only God isn't done with Elijah. There's something about God's presence here, a constancy that Elijah miscalculated on. Let me offer a couple of directives that I believe flow out of this passage that I think we can grab onto today, especially as we think about God in the stillness. God's constancy holds us when our own sense of stability is shaken. God's constancy, God's ever-present Spirit holds us when our moorings, our stability is shaken. You know, we might find ourselves in similar impossible places that were like Elijah's, where hope is distant, if any hope at all. Maybe we should be able to find a way, even as Elijah should have been able to find a way, if we just try harder. Got to figure this out. But he couldn't. He wouldn't. And neither for us as well. We can't always do that. We, just like Elijah, are done. Sometimes we have to have someone else hand us the food when we can't on our own. Sometimes someone has to issue maybe a challenge point to point us in the right direction. It takes another sometimes to believe for us, to believe that there's more. Someone else who has the wherewithal to speak into our lives, to help us see a bigger picture. What seems impossible sometimes can be seen differently to another person. You know, when someone is running for their lives, their perspective narrows. Yes? Whenever we are fearful, when we are feeling like it's impossible, our perspectives all of a sudden, when our sons get in trouble or they're facing a difficult time, it's either this or this and there's no other option. And as parents or as other adults in their life, you have to step in and say, well, what about the third way, per se? We need people around us that help to widen that narrow perspective. We underestimate at times the different perspective that other people bring into our lives. How wide, I might ask, is our perspective for CMC these days? We're in a time of transition. For some, it's opportunity. And for others, maybe not so much. Maybe there's a shaking narrowness that has taken over your life. Maybe our job as a church is to face up to that narrowness, that narrow perspective, and to say, we need another perspective. We need the people around us. When it seems that the church is running for its life, where do we go for life-giving bread? What helps us to stop? Be still and listen. I believe we experience God's constancy, God's stability when we partake in that living bread. Second directive I would just offer yet would be that God's presence often appears in the unexpected. In the midst of the noise, the wind, the earthquake, the fire, God appears in ways that maybe we don't expect. Just coming off a day yesterday of watching a little bit of football, I always do this, right? Bring life's involvements in with sermon prep. And I couldn't help but pay attention to something when I was watching football, that when offensive plays are run, there are distractions that are put in place so the defense can't tell what's coming. And most sports do that, right? In track, in running, sometimes there's a rabbit or a runner that takes off to kind of throw people off their game instead of running your race. In baseball, I love the fake pitcher hiding the ball trick, right? Where the pitcher hides the ball and the base runner doesn't know where it's at, and all of a sudden they get tagged out when they don't know where it's at. Distraction. It's a strategy that isn't just in sports, but I believe it's in our journeys as well. So easy to see things that pop up, call it eye candy. Things that distract us from what's important, from what God's voice could be. Distractors like the wind, the quake, and the fire were there for Elijah. They all begged for his attention. You know, we like predictability. We like knowing what to expect. That's not just an age thing. It's not just for people who are wired a certain way. We all like predictability. And we work toward that. We work toward that in our lives. We like stability. We like assurance in our relationships. We like it in the economy. We like it in our seasons, in our health. We like predictability. Predictability here has escaped Elijah. He's facing what we might call a roller coaster of emotions. He's running for his life. He's stopping. He's sleeping. He's waking up, getting more food. You're going to need more food because there's 40 days yet. Then he runs some more, heads to the mountains. Finally arrives in the mountains. Elijah's facing anything but stability, anything but assurance. His life is like turned upside down. Mountains are a great place. We've lived in Colorado, we've lived in Pennsylvania. In both places, mountains are refuges. Mountains are places to go to get away, to be quiet, to get away from the heat, the people, to retreat. For Elijah, the mountain was a place to hide. It was a place where, in these times, where the gods dwelled. And this mountain, Mount Oreb or Sinai, was considered God's mountain. So why not? Did Elijah know that's where he was going? That's where God wanted him to go, at least. He ended up there. What was this to Elijah? It was a place of safety, but he was still all over the place. The mountain represented stability, predictability. He gets here. He sleeps, wakes up, and finally has the wherewithal to hear something. a voice. Was it a voice? Was it something still? Was it a sense? But he heard God speak to him saying, Elijah, why are you here? And instantly, Elijah goes into this tirade about how he's worked so hard. He's a prophet. He's worked so hard to do God's work, but Israel's falling away. Things are torn down. Everybody's going against God. And he's fighting for God, and now they're trying to kill him. Can you imagine? Elijah just goes off. And that's when God says, listen. Listen. What a response. But Elijah does. And he says, look for the Lord who's passing by. And so he looked for the eye candy. He looked for the things that were put in place to get his attention. The wind, the earthquake, the fire. Not there. We come back to this picture of a God who shows up in the unexpected. And in our desire for predictability, we show up on Sunday mornings, we show up in our church environments, and we say, God will be here. We sing this way, we preach this way, we read the Bible this way, we do children this way. God will be here. Hit. How much of that is fire? How much of that is earthquake? How much of our comings and goings becomes more distraction than God showing up? We mean well. We want in the worst way to hear God. And yet, as we listen to this story, we realize that Elijah, great man of God, has to be rewired a bit. And so we ask ourselves, how does rewiring happen in us? How are we able to listen in a way that we really do sense when God is going by, when the Spirit nudges us? What are those situations where we can really After the fire, there was a sound. Isn't this kind of interesting? Thin and quiet. A sound. Helps us to think in a little different way, doesn't it? Silence is something that for many of us is a scary thing. When we talk about silence in worship, we get a little unnerved sometimes. When we talk about silence at home, we like to have music on or have something on. We don't like to have the silence at home. If we live alone, we need to have people around us. Being by ourselves is difficult. Silence is not easy. In our world, we're told that we need sound, we need action, we need things around us. And yet God's still small voice, we hear that term so much. How can still and small go along with noisy and busy? How long did Elijah wait? Again, pieces we don't know. And what was God trying to get across to Elijah? Because when God asked again at the very end, Elijah, why are you here? We don't have verse 14 here, but in the very next verse, he says exactly, almost word for word, the same response that he gave initially. So what did Elijah hear differently? What kind of a different response? Did God get a response that God wanted? If we imagine a little bit, we might imagine that Elijah, rather than being with contempt and with angst, he might have responded more with a understanding spirit. I don't know. We can imagine that. But all we know is that God called Elijah to listen and then to go. As we listen not just with our ears, but with our spirit. And we listen when we can't do it by ourselves, we listen together. Listening takes work. It takes creativity sometimes, but it also takes a willing heart. I would just call us to take this story, this small story within a bigger narrative, and note the importance of listening through the noise. You know, transition times can be noisy. Where are the mountain caves that provide for us thin, quiet perspective? Where are the storms that we need to listen through? Listen in the silence. Listen in the noise. Listen for the sound of the Spirit's voice. Amen.